Hi, Janina. Thank you for joining me today. Could you start just by introducing yourself and telling our viewers, our students, a little bit about what you've been doing since you graduated?
Sure, thank you. And first of all, thanks for the opportunity also to participate in this. I graduated in 2011 from Magdalen College, and I did modern languages, so French, Italian, and Portuguese. And sort of immediately after graduating, I worked in global health for a while, starting with an internship in Geneva, and subsequently worked for a global health consultancy that worked sort of in the development sector, based out of Berlin. And then after that, I spent some time in the field, as they say, in Mozambique, working with a small NGO there, and decided that I wanted to specialize a little bit more in the sector that I was working in. So I did a master's in development studies at the Institute of Development Studies in Brighton, as part of the University of Sussex. And straight after that, I moved to Kenya to work for an American social enterprise called One Acre Fund. I stayed with them for about 5 years, and I was responsible for multiple countries in East Africa, working with governments, and I was based out of Kenya, but traveled quite a lot in the area, and then moved to West Africa, to Guinea, and worked for both Care International and Dalberg, which is a development consulting firm, in total for about a year. The whole thing was slightly interrupted by COVID, which I'm sure sounds familiar to many. So I'm now based in Berlin, and I work for a development program funded by the German Ministry of Agriculture. My country portfolio is still largely focused on Sub-Saharan Africa, and officially my employer is a consulting company because the ministry has commissioned a general agent to manage this program for them. And so, yeah, I focus mostly on Africa still, with one additional project in Asia.
Great, thank you. And how did you kind of get started with all of that? If you could just give us a bit more detail. Sometimes students are kind of not sure where the starting point might be after they graduate or after getting their masters.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't straightforward. You know, when you sort of list your CV like that, it all sounds very clean and finding all these positions one after the other. It definitely wasn't like that. I applied for a lot of graduate schemes out of Cambridge. There were a few in the development sector, but others that are also sort of more broadly related to the public sector. They were quite competitive, I found, so I got quite close in some of them, but it didn't result in a job in the end. And then sort of in parallel, I explored a few internship opportunities, and the way that I got to work in Geneva was through the Cambridge Global Health Internship Scheme. I'm actually not sure that it exists currently, but I'm sure there's other programs like that, and it basically connects Cambridge graduates that work in the international organizations in Geneva to graduates, or I think finalists as well. And so that's really how I got a lot of connections subsequently for jobs. So the job that I got after that in Berlin, I made connections like that. And I also know that other people who did the internships with me in Geneva went to stay on in the organizations where they interned and got jobs like that. So internships are not necessarily a bad starting point. They can always turn into a job afterwards. Otherwise, the positions that I looked at would commonly be something like junior analyst or associate. Those are very common positions for entry level, but university graduates, I would say. And I try to keep an open mind. I knew that I roughly wanted to work internationally and in development, an impact focused job, but it doesn't always have to be a specific sector. And just learning some skills initially after graduation is very useful for really any sector, I think. So I try to be open about that as well. but yeah, definitely not a straightforward process, applying for lots of things when everyone else is also applying.
Absolutely, and thank you, because I think it can feel when you're in the midst of it like there's a really clear path and everyone else knows what they're doing, and you're the only one who's experiencing all these twists and turns. But I know myself, just from interviewing lots of people at different stages in their career, most people have an unexpected bump in the road, or they kind of start going one way and then another. Have you got any advice for anyone who is sort of feeling a bit lost like that at the moment, as to how to kind of keep going through those twists and turns?
I definitely find the sort of big programs where you apply and you don't really know what happened to your application and everyone else seems to be getting a job, I think I found those quite discouraging. So I did try and get feedback after those processes. So knowing, for example, that I didn't make it into the last 50 candidates out of 3,000 helps a lot, because then you know that your application was probably quite good and it was just because you didn't speak Mandarin Chinese or something very specific, you know. So I found that quite helpful to put into context that it wasn't necessarily that I was doing anything wrong, and it was just that there was a lot of competition, or they were looking for something very specific. I would also bear in mind that this is just the start, and any experience that you get now will still be useful and transferable later on. So if you don't get the dream job, and maybe you get a job that was sort of your third or fourth choice down the list, it might still be worth at least considering that, and you're not tied to it for a long period of time. So just seeing which options could actually teach you something that could still be valuable later on, I think is also helpful. And one thing I think that is always helpful is building connections. You can always do that whether or not you have a job currently or not. But unfortunately, as in many sectors, it often works through connections that you hear of opportunities, or sometimes there isn't even an opportunity and you talk to an organization that sounds interesting, and then actually it turns out in a couple of months there might be an opportunity that comes up. So just building those connections early on is also very helpful, I think, and makes you feel a bit more connected even if nothing seems to be working out.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people have this preconception, don't they, with networking, that it's sort of men in suits and it's corporate jobs and it's, you know, very kind of transactional, but sometimes it can just be talking to people about things you find interesting.
Exactly, yeah, and reaching, I mean, everyone has LinkedIn these days, for example, so it's also very easy to get in touch with people.
Thank you so much. It's really, really helpful just to hear your kind of journey up to this point. What about the role that you're doing at the moment? Could you give us a bit of a sense of what that involves in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so it's fairly different from the roles that I had before. As I said, I was sort of in the field before. What I do now is basically overseeing the implementation of development projects in the agricultural sector on behalf of the donor, which is the Ministry of Agriculture in Germany. So this means I review project reports, I do monitoring and evaluation, so oversee evaluations of impact in the program and progress. I track funding requests and disbursements, and the most exciting part is probably that I get to conceptualize new projects as well, and select the implementing partners and organizations on the ground for those as well. And then essentially the donor is our client. So there's also political requests sometimes that come from the German government, that specific parties want to know how much is being spent in, say, interventions for climate resilience and things like that. So we respond to that as well. In normal times, there would be more travel as well. So for example, we would go to countries for planning missions to scope out the landscape for a new project, for example, or to conduct an evaluation. That is starting again slightly, but obviously right now still very complicated, especially considering that most of the countries that our projects are located have not been privileged enough to get access to vaccines as much as the Western world, and so yeah, travel restrictions are quite tricky sometimes still. But in theory, there's that travel as well.
And if someone's either at that really early stage of thinking, is this the kind of career path, the kind of industry they want to work in, or if they know that it is and they're thinking, okay, I need to develop some transferable skills, which ones are going to be useful to me? What would you say the kind of the qualities or the attributes or the strengths that kind of might be an indicator that this people will be successful in this sort of role, the kind of work that you do?
So I definitely, and this applies especially to COVID times, but also in general, patience and persistence. If you know that you want to work in development, it's just a reality that these are often very complex settings, multinational, multicultural, and depending on where you work, things just take longer and the systems might be different. So it definitely takes a lot of patience with those procedures to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel and not lose hope that things are going to work out. There's definitely a lot of problem solving and creativity involved, I would say, and in any of the jobs that I've had in the sector. Things don't often go according to plan, and so being able to pivot and finding creative solutions around roadblocks. So for example, when I was working in Kenya, there were a lot of unexpected government regulations or maybe not even official rules, but suddenly you had to respond to a roadblock like that where you couldn't do what you were planning on doing, and then finding solutions to that and not getting discouraged by that is very helpful. And then, of course, the sort of context-specific awareness and sensitivity that you I'm assuming now that we're talking about people coming from the Western world, things that we hold to be true or your perspectives might not necessarily be what applies in the countries where development projects are implemented. And so being able to listen and being open-minded about what might be the right approach is very important, I think, in order to do this job in a way that responds to what's actually needed on the ground, because development has been done for a long time in a very top-down manner, where the donor brings the money and also decides what the beneficiaries need, and that's not necessarily, unless they know the context very well and spend a lot of time there, that's not necessarily then results in the right interventions.
And actually, you've mentioned a couple of things there, both kind of responding to the pandemic, but also that perhaps slight shift in focus from the top-down approach. What are the sort of big topics, the big issues, the things that people are talking about at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's probably no secret that aid or development has been, a lot of money has been spent in this sector by the Western world, by industrialized countries, without always having tremendous results or impact. When you look at, I can't give you any figures off the top of my head, but there's a lot of money that has gone into development over the past decades. And when you look at how some of those countries are doing right now, you do wonder where it's gone. And so the first question, I think increasingly also as funding is more tricky for even industrialized countries, because we are now facing a pandemic, for example, and I think the UK, for example, recently cut development spending. The first question is always about impact and value for money, and what is actually being achieved by spending all this money. And I think that will probably always be the big question to solve in development. I think there are some interesting approaches emerging now that maybe haven't been tried out that much yet, that are more private sector focused, less sort of traditional. So, for example, there's this model of social enterprises where services or products are being offered, but they're not necessarily free, which might seem counterintuitive, because you always think, well, you work with poor people and so they shouldn't be charged anything. but actually it results in a lot more ownership and commitment to participating in whatever it is, or in taking care of the products that are being received. And so there are interesting models like that are emerging. Another thing that has been researched quite extensively and is somewhat implemented by some organizations is the idea of unconditional cash transfers. So, you know, traditionally we think, well, we can't just give people money and then they can decide what to do with it, but actually when the research shows that you can, and that the recipients of aid often know what to do with the money much more than the people that send the money. And so that's also an interesting idea in my perspective. Otherwise, I know this is a buzzword, but sustainability is always an issue as well, especially when you look at sort of the traditional models where you have fairly short projects that are being funded for, say, 3 years, and then what? So I think looking at the effect of the interventions after the donor is gone is always going to be a tricky topic, and goes back to the impact question and the value for money question as well. Yeah, so I think those are some of the shifts that are taking place right now. I'm hopeful that there's going to be more innovation coming in that direction, which is also going to probably change who is getting involved in development. So traditionally, that's been a lot of NGOs and governments, but there's no reason that the private sector per se is not necessarily evil, and can still, you know, there's a lot of products that are inherently interesting also for developing countries, like solar panels, for example, just as an example. But it might be a for-profit company selling them. So I would consider that development as well. And there's additional money like that coming into the sector as well.
It's really interesting, and maybe something that people might not be as aware of, or might not consider when they're trying to think of work that has a social impact, that has a development impact. Just that kind of breadth of organisation that you might work for. If you had any kind of advice for current students, recent graduates who are really at the start of their career, is there anything that you'd kind of recommend that they do at the moment that would be helpful for them to be learning about or trying out?
I think in general for this sector, if you do want to work in development, I think it's very important to figure out early on your kind of level of comfort with different situations. So there's obviously many different settings in which you can work. For example, now I'm working from a very comfortable place, but I'm also very far removed from what's happening on the ground. This is probably the polar opposite of working in an emergency setting in a humanitarian intervention. So being directly on the ground implementing projects is not necessarily for everyone. It can be quite, it always sounds very glamorous, you know, you get to travel and you get to live in exotic countries and so on, but it takes a lot of resilience, and it's quite tough to live in some of the places. So yeah, I would definitely test this out, and you know, you can do this through travel, of course, or my first experience in Africa was in a volunteering project in Togo, where I just went for a couple of weeks, and I'll admit it was quite a shock to the system. You know, if you're from the Western world and then you suddenly live in a village, a remote village in Africa that has no electricity and nothing, it's quite different. And so I would definitely recommend testing those things out to determine your comfort levels, and also to determine what kind of roles you would like to consider going into the sector. Another thing would probably be, sorry.
No, you can carry on, please do.
I think another thing would be about specific roles. I mean, my first degree didn't really qualify me for anything in particular. I spoke some languages afterwards, and I was probably, I had quite a broad sort of knowledge about the countries where those languages are spoken. Tried to focus a little bit on politics. So there's one way to sort of customize your degree a little bit, maybe. But of course, there's also lots of people go straight into a master's after their first degree, and that might be useful if you know that you want to bring a specific skill to the sector. So I know a couple of people, for example, who went on to do a law degree after doing languages, and then you know, they might work as a lawyer for a humanitarian organization, or they might work with refugees. There's all sorts of things that you could be doing, but then you have a specific skill that you can bring to the sector, as opposed to the more sort of transferable skill set that I would consider myself to have, for example, that is more sort of the generalist, and then you can still do lots of things, but they might not be as specific in the job. There's other examples. For example, a few people that did their internship in Geneva with me went on to do medicine, and so then you're a doctor, and of course you can also work in development settings if you're a doctor. So thinking a little bit about whether there's specific skills that you'd like to contribute, or whether you're not quite sure, and then you can explore different sections as well. I also did a lot of student associations and societies at Cambridge that gave me a little bit of an idea. There's the UN Association, for example. We got to visit the UN headquarters in Geneva at some point, and you get a little bit of an idea of what it might be like to work for a massive organization like that. Do you like that sort of thing or not? Yeah, so definitely that. Not everyone does modern languages. Of course, there's a big advantage in having that year abroad, because you basically have 16 months to play with, and you can try lots of different things. But I think there's still time during term breaks in the summer, for example, to get those experiences through travel or volunteering.
And apologies, because this wasn't a question we talked about before the interview, but just because you talked about that, you know, doing the master's either straight after your degree, or obviously you had a bit of a gap between your undergraduate and your master's, and that's a question that comes up quite often with students who are thinking a master's degree would be useful. What are the pros and cons of doing it straight away? What are the pros and cons of leaving it and getting some work experience? I just wondered what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, I definitely found it to be very beneficial to have some work experience before deciding what to specialize in, but that was also because I really wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do after I graduated. You know, with a languages degree, I was also, apart from development, I knew I wanted to work internationally, but I was also considering maybe more academic jobs or something that's a bit more in the cultural arts sector, or different areas. So for me, it would have been, I think, a very different path if I had, it would have been a different path if I'd gone into a master's straight away, apart from the fact that I wouldn't have known really what to pick. So I think if you're really not sure, I don't think there's a need to rush straight into it. Of course, if you're sure, then I don't see why you wouldn't. For me, I have to say that my ideas of what I would do changed quite a lot through the couple of years that I worked in between my bachelor's and my master's. And had I not had that work experience, I think I would have maybe chosen a different master's. For my specific master's, it was also required to have some work experience, which is not always the case, but it can be useful because then you have some real life situations to draw on, especially if you're doing a master's that's a bit more applied. And so it's helpful to share, amongst others, the experiences that you might have had working a little bit and getting different perspectives on that. Yeah, for example, after working for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization in Geneva, I found myself considering a medical degree. which I then tested out by volunteering in a hospital and found that it wasn't for me. But I know others that then decided it was, and they went on to be a doctor. If I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had the same perspectives, which is not to say that my ideas about what I want to be doing aren't changing still now, but yeah, in short, I think I would definitely advocate getting some experience before going into a master's if you're not quite sure what you want to do.
Yeah, and thank you. And I think, you know, just that message that's come across through everything you've said, really, that there is time to try things out and change your mind and give something a go, and then it kind of nudges you in a different direction as well. And I think that's really, really valuable for people to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I know it doesn't feel like that because, of course, especially everyone who's at Cambridge, they're ambitious and they want to, you know, do meaningful things and do them quickly. But yeah, from my experience, just perspectives change, and there's value to taking some time to think about what you're doing. And the benefit of doing something that maybe isn't ideal is also always that you then find out what you don't want to do, which can also help with decisions on what you want to do eventually.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of kind of career journeys, what, if you don't mind me asking, what thoughts have you got about what you might do next and where your career might take you?
Yeah, I think I haven't talked too much about my time in East Africa, but I definitely enjoyed both the sort of the hands-on, being a bit closer to the action on the ground experience, but also slightly alternative, non-traditional models to development. So I worked for a social enterprise there that basically offered, it was a bit like Amazon for smallholder farmers, I suppose. Offering very, very simple services to people that usually don't have access to it, but at a cost. And so I'm, definitely interested in moving towards more private sector approaches again in the future. There's a couple of interesting models out there. I'm also very aware that climate change and renewable energy and sort of new technologies are becoming a very cross-cutting issue, basically in all sectors. And so I'd also be interested in maybe exploring those areas a little bit more. And yeah, mostly interested in sort of the innovative models that are emerging. There's a lot of models that always sound very complicated. You know, everything is blockchain these days. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but newer approaches to sort of tackling the biggest issues that developing countries are facing and people living there. For me, it's always sort of both, in order to be able to explore different areas. I mean, this sector is just very diverse, but also the ultimate goal has always been for me to do a job that is impactful, and so organizations that focus on that are very interesting to me. I know this is not a very concrete response, but I hope that's also encouraging to see that even if you look at my CV and it looks very solid and sort of or very organized, there's always value in reconsidering what you're doing and trying to explore different areas of the sector that you're working in.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of my colleagues said to me once, you know, a career makes sense in retrospect. When you look back at it, it looks like there's a nice linear journey that's taken you to this point and will take you to the next point. I think as we go along, we're all kind of trying things out and figuring things out as we go.
Yeah, exactly. I definitely agree.
And really nice to hear what you're thinking about next, as well as obviously what's gone before. Just thank you so much for joining us and sharing a bit of your story today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure it'll be really useful and interesting for our students to hear about as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. And I'm also, I've quite enjoyed over the last couple of years to connect with people over the career service platform as well. I know there's a new one now, so always happy to answer questions as well if anyone wants to reach out.
Great, thank you so much. I'll put the link for that down below in the description so students can find it there.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.